Ladies and gentlemen, we have Professor Fisher with us tonight to talk about this brand new book that landed on our shores this past weekend. When I found on Monday morning, the book was still in the Cape Town docks, and I asked very nicely if Protea Distribution Centre could do something for us for this launch. They managed to get it through customs, they managed to get the books released, they got it to their warehouse, and Wednesday afternoon I had my copies on the table here. That's wonderful, so special thanks to a wonderful distributor and publishing house in South Africa. We have to do the COVID thing, so please masks. And
am I allowed to talk
no,
about
the speaker done.
Okay.
Just don't sneeze.
I asked Penny Pistorius to introduce Professor Fisher. So Penny, over to you. Thank you.
I'll try and keep my distance. When the first I knew that Roger Fisher had come to Swellendam was when I got a message from Louise Mocker. Do you know about this Professor Fisher guy? And I said, well, if it's the Professor of Architecture from Pretoria, then I certainly do know about him, and we're very lucky to have him. And indeed, so it turned out. Roger was born in Cape Town, but moved as a child to Pretoria with his family, where he did his schooling, and where he also graduated with a Bachelor's of Architecture. And after some years in private practice, went back to the University of Pretoria and did, while teaching in the Department of Architecture, did his Master's and a PhD. And as you can see from the array on the table of published books, he has had a very long and illustrious academic career in various related sort of fields. He is a very notable educator and teacher and developer of architectural and design education. He has done a lot of research in architecture itself, in architectural history, in cultural affairs, heritage conservation. He is one of the major figures in this country at the moment. And cultural heritage and cultural hybridity is what I'm imagining we're going to be hearing a bit more about now. Cultural hybridity is not a term that I'm particularly familiar with. But clearly, if we're going to be talking about the intersection between Dutch and South African architecture in this country, then that is a kind of hybrid. I hope I'm not talking complete nonsense.
Absolutely correct. That's why I found it interesting.
In 2013, Professor Dr. Roger Fisher was awarded the gold medal of the Heritage Association of South Africa, which is the highest award that one can get in heritage conservation fields. And in 2014, just to mention some of the accolades, that little orange book over there, The Architectural Guide to South Africa, which is co-written with Nicholas Clark, also from the University of Pretoria, was awarded Merit Awards both from the Gauteng Institute of Architecture and the South African Institute of Architecture gave it an award of merit. So I think we're extremely lucky to have such an eminent professor of architecture among us, and extremely lucky to be able to have the very first live face-to-face launch of this fascinating looking new book, which covers the interactions between South African and Dutch architecture from 1906 to 1962. Is that right?
Correct. 1902 to 1960.
1902. I knew it was 60 years.
Okay.
So thank you very much Roger, for being here, and we look forward to hearing about the book.
Thanks for that thanks for that introduction, Penny. Yeah, it's all true. I can't argue with any of it. If you don't mind, I'm going to sit down while I do the talk. If you can't hear me, just please tell me. Is this level of voice okay for everybody? You're all with me? Good. Okay. Right. Common Ground is the latest in what have been a number of research projects done in conjunction with the Dutch Embassy, the cultural desk of the Dutch Embassy, and what the talk, this isn't a talk actually, this is like a fireside chat, so certainly not a lecture. I don't intend lecturing anymore in my life. I'm not very comfortable with talks, so this will be anecdotal, and it'll really just be cherry picking at interesting bits and pieces that I think a general public might find interesting. I have also concentrated on people more locally associated, so that they may be examples that you might encounter or have encountered more readily, being in this neck of the woods. I thought the first thing to do is just maybe locate the study in my enterprises and my engagement with Dutch culture over the years. I myself only came, I would imagine, to discovering Dutch culture in my high school years, when my best friend had Dutch grandparents living just around the corner from where we lived in Pretoria. And with him, I would sometimes go and visit them. And certainly his grandmother couldn't speak a word of English. I think they still communicated in Dutch. And certainly her particular and their lifestyle was Dutch, which had a certain intrigue. I then went eventually to study architecture, and the very first lecture I had was a certain professor, now his name's going to, he's not come to me. We called him Baas Klokker, that's right. He was a gentleman, probably just a bit younger than myself now, but to us as young students, he seemed very ancient of days, and he spoke in a very broken Afrikaans, and I, coming from a first language English household, had great difficulty following what these lectures were all about. But certainly his lectures were engaging. He was very erudite, and obviously the reading material at that stage was all English-based. So all the reading was in English. But I need to add to that at that stage, the historiography of South African architecture was really very, very limited. Those books, the earlier books that came from like Trotter, Fairbridge, etc., De Bosdari, even Bierman, weren't in common circulation. So, we didn't learn that much about South African architectural history, certainly not from literary sources. Most of the literature that was there was on Cape Dutch architecture. There was Lucock's early 19th century architecture, which is more on the English architecture. And then why I'm mentioning all these books is because most of them were published, it wouldn't have occurred to me then, but by a certain A.A. Balkema, and a Dutch immigrant to South Africa who published high quality books, and certainly of the best published books at that stage, because he was very particular about the quality of the books but they were not, most of them not available to us as students, probably in the library. But so there was a tenuous another Dutch connections, but not again engaging in directly in the fact of the Dutchness or Dutch culture. When I came to actually lecturing, no, before I lectured in architecture, this friend of mine had immigrated. He was one of the conscription refugees, if you like. He took himself back to the Netherlands, and in 1981 I visited the Netherlands for the first time. He stayed on a boat. It was sort of very much part of the hippie culture at the time, or remnants of hippie culture. Amsterdam society was very, very militant, certainly youth society. There were krakers, there was squatting, there was all kinds of things on the go. And South Africa was the real polecat of the world. So as a South African, one felt very foreign and I might even say unwelcome. But certainly it was very engaging. I, in those days, still used a bicycle. I had only just got my car license. I spent up until the age of 30 on a bicycle. And Amsterdam, as you'll know, is bicycle friendly. So I toured Amsterdam and way beyond by bicycle. And the other thing is you could take the bike on a train, go to wherever you were headed, and then do that area by bike. So a lot of what I engaged was on bicycle. By 1986, I was appointed as a lecturer, and my engagements were in teaching design, studio, building technology, and history of architecture. And so a lot of and they were very generous at the university in giving us slide materials in order to build up a slide collection of a university. That department of architecture was known for its very broad slide collection of certainly historical buildings and contemporary. So I would go around cycling and photographing, and I got to know Amsterdam pretty well and became pretty much engaged with certainly the social architecture, social housing and so forth. It held a certain intrigue, and after that I started looking for other connections in terms of Cape Dutch influences, but not in the traditional sense of Cape Dutch, but more from, let's say, technological or cultural, technological, rather than stylistic. The stylistic, I think, is really just an external add-on to what actually drives the making of architecture. So that's a bit of background. And then in 2002, I guest edited this particular edition of Leading Architecture, where I went again back to look at, it was 2002 was the bicentenary of the Batavian ruling in the Cape, which was the return of the Cape to Dutch rule, but under the Republican Dutch rule, for which I think it was 4 or 5 years, I can't quite remember. And I did that sort of bicentennial issue and looked again at the Dutch engagements. Okay. Through all of that came the opportunity, through a young colleague of mine who'd met up with a guy from the Royal Dutch Cultural, I forget what it's called in Dutch, it's in the back of the book, and were alerted to the agreement that the South Africans had at government level for engaging at a cultural level of cultural exchange. And we put in proposals, and from those proposals have come 3 projects. The one is the Eclectic Dutch, Eclectic Wilhelmins, we called it, to distinguish it from Victorian, Wilhelmina being the then first princess and then queen. And the eclectic period of the 19th century, that one's more Transvaal orientated. Then Nicholas and I did a survey of about 300 residual built environment artifacts. It was a trip of about 3,000 kilometers, if not more. Not done all at once, but certainly we documented over 300 residual or remains of that particular enterprise. I will get to that in the slide if I give myself enough time. And then, of course, Common Ground, which is the years 1902, the end of the Anglo-Boer War, when the Dutch-speaking republics lost their independence, to 1961, when South Africa became a republic and entered or left the Commonwealth. So what we have looked at in that time is from what they call the push and pull factors, and my colleagues have looked at those aspects. Why were the Dutch leaving and what were the attractions here in South Africa? It's basically two waves, just pre the Second World War, then after the Second World War. And then various of my colleagues, half the book has got Dutch input or people based in the Netherlands, the other half people based in South Africa. But certainly it's looking at the cross-cultural perspectives, and I will discuss some of those that have influenced the built environment in South Africa. When we started the project, we were expecting maybe 20, but it's grown. Of course, the minute you start scratching something, and eventually we had to cut down what we looked at, and we've only looked at the architectural influences, but it's far broader in the built environment. So, okay, that sort of gives a background. Right, the Wilhelmins is the period of the old Dutch Republic and the time that Weerde started public works in the Zuid-Afrikaanse Republiek under the Kruger government, very deliberately brought in because of the commonalities, the broederskap, if you like, between, and certainly to keep away the English at all costs. Prior to that, President Burgers had been in charge of the Transvaal Republic, and he had ambitions, even before Kruger, to join the Transvaal by rail to Lorenzo Marx, and set about a project and getting money overseas for the Lebombo Rail, what was then called the Lebombo Rail. He met up with this young man, Antonie Maurice de Wet, or Maurits, I don't quite know how the Dutch would pronounce it, but he anglicized and became Antonie Maurice de Wet. He was encouraged by Burger to come and join the enterprise for the Lebombo Rail, but by the time he got here, the project had been abandoned. Burger was out, and by 1880, was the first Anglo-Boer War, and he abandoned he was in Potchefstroom, went to the Cape, set up practice. And in the Cape, he became very much engaged, you can see through his enterprises, in the setting up of associations for professionalizing architecture, for professionalizing the engineer, architect, and surveyors, who were all close in those days. And I found a member of our Institute of Architects. He was very avant-garde in his enterprises. He was a very successful commercial architect. He introduced steel frame structures. He was very much had his finger on the pulse with what was going on in the USA and America at that time. Built up the first steel frame structures in South Africa, and the steel frame structures also allowed the introduction of these large glass frontages, also the industrialization, the manufacture of glass, that you can make big panes of glass and get rid of these little cottage panes and what have you, which would have preceded it, and made what at the time these rather avant-garde little town buildings. This is one I'm particularly fond of, but even the facade in that is actually pattern book architecture, probably imported, certainly not locally manufactured, but a very charming little building, and still in Long Street in Cape Town. In Malmesbury is the, what's it, Christelijke? No, I need to change. I'm seeing it and you're not, sorry. Christelijke Jeugdzaal, also a work of De Wit, 1908. So we'll see we have now entered the period of, okay, he's in the Cape Colony. That hadn't changed status yet, but certainly had up north, we were in the times of the Orange Free State or Orange River Colony and the Transvaal Colony. And one can see in the styling that it is not traditionally either Victorian or at this stage Edwardian, that it has other stylistic elements that distinguishes it slightly from what his contemporaries would have been doing. And he did this particularly out, he was active in Paarl, active in Malmesbury and that. So where he was away from the commercial centre of Cape Town, and particularly working for church and so forth, we'll see another one of his church buildings, his style reverts to some sort of more European-based eclecticism. This is the Nederduitse Gereformeerde Kerk in Bredasdorp. Probably those of you who are local know it. That is also Antonie de Wit. But that is very much indistinguishable from what was then current church architecture, the Gothic Revival style architecture, but in Cape whitewash, which many of them are. Interestingly enough, though, the wrought iron or cast iron work, all wrought iron work, but this is cast iron work with wrought iron, is of comes from London, a British industrial production. And these kind of, the cast iron that came to the colonies, I don't know if you know it, but the reason why it was brought was really as ballast to the ship. All the products of British industrial or industry, and certainly corrugated iron, cast iron, all of that decorative stuff was brought into the colonies as ballast. You'll find far less of it in Britain itself, and used then and exchanged at the ports as they loaded cargo. So they offloaded what has become part of the architecture we protect. Right, our next candidate is Johannes Egbertus Wixerboxer. I quite like his name. He arrived in 1888. I've told you in 1887 that Kruger had set up a public works department under Weerda. He was one of the early arrivals. He no sooner arrived than he was also entered into private practice with another of his Dutch colleagues, Klaas van Reyse. I won't go into all their detail. He then we moved to the Free State, which was also a Boer Republic at the time, and joined their public works department. And then but they were allowed to do competition work, and he entered a competition for the Natural History Museum in Cape Town, which he won. So he then set off to the Cape, and he was also then with De Wit, and there were many others, Baker included, in help setting up the professionalization of architecture. The Cape Museum, you will know, most of you, I would guess, natural history, what it was the Natural History Museum, what is now the Ezekiel Museum. And but one can very much see the Dutch influences, particularly in the older styling, before it has been re-whitewashed and so forth. I've included also some of the because the idea of the museum, the public museum, was quite novel at the time, and prestigious for a town to be able to present their cultural connection through a museum. And what I find interesting are the displays in themselves have become relics, and I will show you one, because he then got the commission for what we call now as the Albany Museum. But in what you're seeing is it in its original state after he designed it, and that is very much Dutch influence with the so-called speklaag architecture, a streaky bacon style, banded red brick and I'm not too sure that's stone or plaster or stucco, but no matter. Then in the 40s it burnt down, or partially burnt down, and it was then redone. Although one can see the remnants in the actual configuration of the facade and that of the original Vixer Boxer building, it has been redone in what was then the prevalent public works style of the Baker School, the Baker with the Cape Dutch Revival. So often buildings as you see them are not actually what the original stylistic intentions are, but certainly in terms of the actual making of the building, and that much of it remains. The only exhibit that I believe comes from the period before the fire, and itself now a relic and an artifact, is of the Mammals Hall. Didn't burn down because that was in the back wing. And the exhibit is still there, and they've left it like that, which I appreciate. They had left it like that. Whether it's still like that, I don't know. These was shot a decade or more ago. Vixer Boxer also did the restyling of the Wynberg Nederduitse Gereformeerde Kerk. I don't know if any of you know it. It was a typical Latin cross church, but with the demands of the Protestant liturgy of having the pulpit as your focus and the preek, the sermon, as being the most important part of that liturgy. They wanted seating arrangement changed from the axial with the kind of direction to the altar to the theatre style arrangement. And what Vixer Boxer has done is added on the apsis to the ends of the Latin crosses and extended the corners to be able to accept the radial theatre arrangement of the nave, the church. Interesting, all the woodwork of the reconfigured church from the inside, and the Dutch architects were particularly well versed in carpentry as a craft, because it was part of a certain tradition of education, is that you came to architecture through a craft. That was the one school. I'll come back to what I've spoken briefly about this. This is the next project that the Dutch funded. And when I say they fund 60%. 40% has to come from South African source, the university or what have you. But obviously that's a sweat equity type thing. Our time is costed, etc., etc., etc. And we bring, so it's not done for profit, it's done as part of that enterprise. This is one of the bridges from, in fact, you're going to see this bridge again. The last engineer, chief engineer, was this person, here are van Kretschmer van Veen. And he had no sooner come out to head up the ZASM, the Nederlands-Zuid-Afrikaanse Spoorwegmaatskappy, when of course the Anglo-Boer War broke out. The railways were obviously a target, and in actual fact what's happened was these Dutch who had built these rails then became part of the explosive experts in demolishing what they'd done in order to hinder the advance of the British forces. So I always find it quite a sad story. He himself, of course, was deported. I mean, he was interrogated because of the destruction of infrastructure and so forth, and then deported. But an interesting connection to South Africa, because we won't meet him here, but you'll meet him in the book if you look at the book. His son came back to South Africa to head up the harbour engineering for the building of the Table Bay Harbour and extensions of the foreshore, and eventually then became chairman of the Nederlands Bank. Just the Barberton branch line is one of the more interesting lines, because it wasn't going to be built when they re-diverted. The Dutch came to building railways in South Africa from their enterprises in Indonesia. They'd learned the tricks of difficult terrain over there, and the last section of the railways, which was the great hindrance to the railways, the development of the railway to the connection between Pretoria and Maputo, or Lorenzo Marx as it was then, was getting down through the Elandspoort and Crocodile rivers. And the original design was to take that rail through Barberton, where of course gold mining was still very active, and take the line then via down to Crocodile River to Lorenzo Marx. But some bright engineers came along and actually surveyed virgin territory and found this other route, which shortened the route, saved the firm a lot of money, and so Barberton was skipped. But that politically, that did not go down well, and they demanded a rail, so that they got private people, the government funded it to start the rail, but of course they went bankrupt in no time, and the ZASM took it over anyway. And it is one of the more interesting rails, and I've actually walked across that bridge. I can't believe it. And that was only 10 years ago. I can't think I'd do it today. It looks far too hair-raising. But a lot of the rail and so forth is still of the original. The other thing was that they came here both with the know-how, but the other thing is the design of rails was like a Meccano set. If you looked at what you needed to do, and you broke up your spans into 30 meters, 20 meters, 10 meters, sometimes 25, and depending on what that span was, you then had set pieces of engineering, inverted trusses, plate girder trusses, fish belly trusses, and so forth. A lot of the stuff then, but the rail was lighter, and a lot of it was then changed by the Brits. So much of the engineering one sees today, although it looks similar, is newer construction. Right. We're now looking at who? Volker Wilco Hesse. And here's a typical of the way these people were educated. He studied architecture at art school, so that was the art side of architecture, if you like. But he also trained as a carpenter and a mason. Okay, married, had 2 children, came to the Cape Colony. This is now after the Anglo-Boer War, and he practiced eventually in partnership with his son, whom he trained in his office. That was the way you got trained in South Africa. You either worked for public works or you worked for another architect, what they called as an improver. And at some point, if enough of your peers respected your abilities and recommended you to the REBA, you could register as an architect and operate on your own. But until such time, you operated under the auspices of another architect. And you'll know why we have him on the books. Rather extraordinary power, let's say. This is at the time with his son, because it's after 1909. 1909, his son entered practice with him. So anything after 1909, but before 1923, when he died, is Hesse, and I've had to do a lot of sorting out on a website I'll get to later, where all of these muddles were. But anyway, Stylistically, I don't quite know what to say about this. It's got a bit of Cape Dutch. Certainly has a very impressive flesh. I recall in the restoration, I think a helicopter came to lift it and fell through the roof. Yeah. So, but one can see that he certainly came here as a skilled carpenter. You don't just knock something like that together. Not that he himself would have done it, but he would have known how it should be done. Other churches of his, he didn't do the original church. These are all Nederduitse gereformeerd, by the way. He didn't do the original church at George, that was Skutter, but he certainly did the extensions of the cross wings. And I think consequent to that, because they'd no sooner done that than the tower fell down. And I can't help but wonder if that bit of knocking around of the church didn't accelerate the falling of the tower. So he's responsible for the rebuild of the tower and the cross wings. All the other churches are his own. The sad little church at the Doorns is no longer a church. You can see that because they built it in what was to be the Doorns, but it landed up in the middle of nowhere because the railway went somewhere else. So it's now acts as an agricultural store for the local farm or something, but also quite a pretty little church. But one can see most of that, the styling of these churches is more traditional, what we call neo-Gothic, unlike the one we've got here in Swellendam. Right, we move on. Our next fellow, Simmerink. Simmerink, it also came out, was also part of Public Works, have I got the right guy? Yes. Oh, we're not quite sure he trained, but he also came to Public Works Department. He must have taken out citizenship, because if you were not a citizen, you left. If you had taken out citizenship, and a lot of them hurriedly, and some of them were given retrospective citizenship, and then they joined the Hollander Corps, and the Hollander Corps had a fairly unhappy episode right at the beginning of the war. They were part of the first encounters with the British forces who had been rushed from India to Durban, and the Battle of Elandslaagte was one of the first engagements. The Hollander Corps were there. They took a beating. You can understand why. The Boer youngsters are raised on a horse. They shoot from a horse. These people were urbanites, and probably rapidly taught how to use a gun. The other thing is that was one of the last close encounter battles of the Anglo-Boer War, where the first and last, where they still had lancers and people with sabers, and who went through the killing fields with their lances and sabers. I mean, this horrified these people, and these poor Hollanders. I can't even imagine. I haven't read an account of what they made of all of this, but I can't imagine. So quite a number of them were killed. There's a monument to them by Moerdijk. A lot of them deported, and of course a lot wounded. I don't think he was part of that engagement, but we don't know enough about it. A lot of them came back. If they stayed in the Transvaal, which was then the Transvaal colony, they had to swear an oath of allegiance to the Crown, and they had to, especially if they wanted to go back into Public Works. Public Works at that stage, you will know, was under the Milner dispensation, and I'm trying to remember who the chappie who was head of Public Works was a military man. It would have been from the Royal Engineers. And I can only imagine what the engagements felt like at that time in those offices. Anyway, but he obviously did well enough, because 1910, you will know, is the year of union. He's appointed as acting assistant district engineer in Pretoria. He's the chief district engineer in charge of the site works and infrastructure of the union building. So, I mean, very responsible position that is given. as once enemy, and then he was transferred into 1915, and in 25 he retired from civil service, and then set up quite a lucrative private practice with the Bank of Netherlands as one of his main clients. You'll read in this episode done by my colleague Catherine Deacon and Marguerite Pienaar. Marguerite's an ex-student of mine as well, and as is Catherine, although I had more of... Marguerite's an ex-master's student of mine. And so the Netherlands Bank is interesting because they were urban, they were connected to commerce, and they were an industry. Those were their focus of funding, and of course they with the focus on export. In other words, through international contacts and so forth. The building has a fairly traditional facade, but if one looks at the interior, and we're in 1927, I think. Am I right? Yes. Quite a stripped, stark, contemporary interior behind this, not quite neoclassical, but still quite conservative, neoclassic influenced facade. They went for the corner sites in urban setting. All the Netherlands banks you'll find are set prominently on a corner site to be seen, and conspicuously engaged. In Port Elizabeth, it also then became the centre of the motor industries, and Simmerink did these enormous projects, both for General Motors and for Ford, Simmerink and Walker. The buildings are still there. I haven't visited them yet, but I will one day, maybe. And in Cape Town, where Walker was based, they were also working for the Boere Saamwerk Beperk, which is the co-op of the wool exporters, the wool industry. So, and that little building still is a lovely deco example, that from 34. Yeah, 1934. You can still see the vestiges of what that building looked like today. It's in Salt River. It's right next to their own private railway line. And it has now served, because it's got huge warehouses and what have you, as offices and for one of these revivalist or African revivalist churches. Right. Our next man, Jongens. One of the more interesting architects we got to encounter and discover, met up with his family. He also came out in one of the later generations. I've said post-Depression. You can see 1936, we're in the years just after the Depression and just before the war. He worked for, it's not there, Ellsworth. Anyway, Walgate, it is there. Walgate and Ellsworth. If you know anything about South African architecture history, Walgate and Ellsworth were engaged, I think, in the building of the University of Cape Town, recommended by Baker. So it's a Dutchman in a Baker office. I don't think there was any antagonism there, though. And then, but from there, he went into the offices of Cape engineers in their into their town planning department. After he left there, he was working for Chapman and Spur, and by 1969, they say, working on his own account. Now, I think one of the reasons why this chap is not known as an independent architect is because I don't think he ever did the special qualifying exam. That's why he was always working with somebody, and possibly even while he was working in City of Cape Town offices, because there you were not, if you were working for a registered or qualified firm, it wasn't a requirement. But obviously later in his life, he must have done or maybe got what they call the old man's clause, where they allowed him to practice because of his experience. I don't know. I don't have enough of that history. But it is interesting what he did. While working in the city of Cape Town, he won the competition for the Huguenot Memorial. And in the book you will see it does have connections to a similar monument, and I can't remember the name, in the Netherlands. But his, I think, is a better quality. Executed, though, in the offices of Walgate and Ellsworth, for whom he'd worked, and also with the help of Kurt Steinberg as sculptor. In the City of Cape Town offices, the cover of the book, you'll see the swimming pool, is it Claremont? Newland swimming pool. Photographs, both those photos by Francois Swanepoel, and these are not drone photos, but this is the Sea Point Pavilion, and I think it's a splendid piece of public architecture, really, and very appropriate to its setting. The Dutch had this idea of the healthiness of the outdoors. I think it might have been one of the attractions to South Africa, and so forth. A piece you won't see, but which is intriguing to me because of its connection to water management and use of concrete, and that is the, what do they call it? The Dam Hoist Gallery. In the bottom corner, you can see what's beneath this building. This is like the center with all the machinery and what have you, and the view over the Vemershoek Dam, and this is one of the feed dams of the city of Cape Town. Built from 953 to 957 with the engineer, city engineer S.S. Morris, and he as in-house architect. But the styling you can see is very much of this industrial aesthetic, which was so beloved of the moderns and the modern movement, but here very appropriately employed in because of its function. But very innovative in its concrete use. The Dutch certainly knew their concrete, and it was a Dutchman, and his name evades me at the moment, but who designed way back in the early 1900s these paraboloid cooling towers and what have you. And South Africa was of the first people to. We have John nodding. I'm glad he's agreeing with me, because he'd probably know better than I. But to use this patent for cooling towers. And shell concrete, I haven't shown much of it, but certainly shell concrete technology was one of the, was one of the technologies that the Dutch brought. Right. You'll remember this episode when they call it the Rhodes Memorial Fire, but this fire, and what is the date there? 22nd of April 2021, we in our project, and news of this fire comes through, you'll think it doesn't affect us, and that is what that Jagger Library looked like afterwards. But unfortunately, we had persuaded the family, my colleagues, had been engaging with the Jongens family and had been given access to the family collection of the Jongens archive, and had persuaded the family to donate it to the University of Cape Town. But because it had not yet been accessioned, it was still lying, waiting to be, it was lying in this part of the library. It is no more. It was, luckily we had a young colleague, and I must end here, I'll end now, go down with Elaine Proust. You'll know Elaine Proust from the Hidden books, Hidden Pretoria, Hidden Johannesburg, Hidden Cape Town, but we engaged his expertise, and we had, he with this, Elaine had photographed much of the archive, not at archival quality, just for the record, but at least that record is there. This is one of the churches he designed, which was demolished. And then, just to close off, all the information is web accessible on this website, which Frank runs, and it is artifacts.co.za. And if you don't know how to use Google, if you're interested in finding out any more about any of these things, you type into Google artifacts.co.za Simmerink, and you will get a link to that page in Artifacts. Right. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your attention. I haven't seen anybody fall asleep yet. I have been told not to bore you to tears or to death. The other thing is just a word of thanks all round. Thank you, Edwin, for the opportunity. Thank you, Frank, for the eats. Thank you, Edwin, for the drinks that are going to follow. Thank you, Devon, for filming, for those people who are, for reasons better known to themselves, want to know what I had to say, but couldn't be here. But we won't put it on social media, so it'll go out privately to those people who are interested. And then thank you all for being here. And I hope to see you again soon.
Any questions?
Ek kan ook in Afrikaans praat. As dit nodig is.
I think you should come back and talk to us about the design of our church.
Yeah.
I'd have to. I'm still wondering about it. It's an extraordinary piece of architecture. Quite novel, quite unique.
Schizophrenic style. Schizophrenic style.
Yeah. No, look, you can see you've got a young architect in the office because there's a lot of muscle building going on.
Anything else? Any questions? Comments? Okay, ladies and gentlemen, the common ground on the left sells for 695 rand. Wilhelmines, 450. We have, how many copies of Wilhelmines do you still have?
Another 8.
Okay, so we've got copies in Swellendam. Common ground we'll have to order. I've got 4 copies and 2 are reserved, but we can let go and order again. They are expensive, but there were only 300 copies brought into the country. So if you want to invest in a good book, I can tell you now, in 5 years from now, this book will sell for 3,000 rand. And 15 years from now, it will sell for 6,000 rand. So
Okay, I'll take all 4.
This is a good way of investing for pension money later, if you need to do that. My next event, and then my next 2 events, and then I'm going to stop for you. The first one is next Friday. It's a book called Coming Home, or Going Home, about a 60-year-old woman who lost her business in the UK, South African woman who went there. Actually, she's originally from Zimbabwe, moved to Cape Town, married another South African. They moved to the UK. They lived in the UK for 20 years. And then everything went wrong. The relationship, the business, her life fell apart. And she said she didn't have the courage to start all over again. So she bought a van and she drove back to Zimbabwe. And the story is about what happened on that. So it's quite fascinating. That is next Friday at 6.
Is it she herself giving the talk?
She's not, she's in Bulawayo.
Oh.
We spoke to her today. She said, I'm negotiating with the chief to get a piece of land so that I can build a hut. It's quite good. She's busy with negotiation. She can't do it. But she's coming, she said. Okay, so there's somebody standing in for her. And we will have a snippet of something she will send us. Next week, Saturday, we will do the opening of the Christmas exhibition, and a lot of you are involved. Alex has just offered to do a live performance. That's his contribution. So don't miss that. Could be interesting. So there will be a lot of works from different artists in and around Swellendam. Okay, I think it's time for wine. Meneer Mokke, just be careful, there's a cable at your feet.